right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining me today. My apologies for the technical difficulties. My name is Sam Blakesley, and I'm a California Sea Grant Fellow at the State Lands Commission. I really appreciate all your time this afternoon, and I'm very excited to share with you all a little bit about California Sea Grant and the State Lands Commission, and a lot about AB 691 as it relates to sea level rise and the work we are doing here to address it. I first want to especially thank Watershed University for hosting me today, and I think that the way we are addressing sea level rise here at State Lands is pretty relevant to all types of planning for climate-related impacts or changes to public services or impacted infrastructure in a watershed, coastal or non-coastal. So I hope that everyone has something to gain from today. And with that, let's get started. All right, so this is the rough agenda that we'll be following today. We'll quickly introduce California and the National Sea Grant Program, as well as the California State Lands Commission and our jurisdiction, which should provide a deeper context and insight into how we are adapting to sea level rise here. I'll then briefly explain granted lands and which granted lands are subject to AB 691 specifically. I'll then walk us through the Ocean Protection Council and Natural Resource Agency's updated sea level rise and safeguarding California guidance released last year, and then we'll get into the legislation of Assembly Bill 691 and its criteria to understand how granted land managers, who I will refer to throughout this presentation as grantees or trustees, are using AB 691 to develop their sea level rise assessments and plans. I'll then go through some specific examples of proposed adaptation measures from assessments that have already been submitted, and I'll wrap it up with some ideas for moving forward based off the state guidance and what we've learned so far through this process. All right, so California Sea Grant, for anyone that isn't familiar, is a collaboration of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the state of California, and universities across the state to create knowledge, products, and services that benefit the economy, the environment, and citizens of California. I am presenting to you today as a Sea Grant Fellow with the State Lands Commission, and I'm completing a one-year fellowship that is designed for recent grad school graduates to apply their academic training in ocean and coastal resource management and science to the public sector. So again, really excited to be here and presenting to you all today. And specifically, Sea Grant offers the services that you see on the slide to address coastal and marine science and policy issues with an overarching mission of research, outreach, and communication. And last but not least, California Sea Grant is one of 33 state programs funded by the National Sea Grant College Program as part of NOAA, and they receive matching funds from states and private sources, and Sea Grant considers itself a boundary organization between the government and research institutions, and it's administered through the Scripps Institute of Oceanography at University of California, San Diego. Right, State Lands Commission. We manage California's tidelands and submerged lands, including navigable waterways of major rivers and lakes, as well as the coast from the mean high tide line out to the state's water boundary of 3 nautical miles. The lands are managed in accordance with the common law public trust doctrine and the California Constitution for statewide public purposes, and these include commerce, navigation, fisheries, preservation of lands in their natural state and open space, wildlife habitat, water-oriented recreation, and so on. And the state legislature has granted the day-to-day management of some of these trust lands to local jurisdictions such as ports or harbor districts or cities. And again, I'll refer to them throughout this presentation as grantees or trustees. So as part of their fiduciary duty, a local trustee of granted public trust land is required to responsibly manage and preserve the trust property on behalf of the state of California. So both the State Lands Commission and the grantees lease the lands for public trust consistent uses. And as we know, climate change and sea level rise will result in a wide range of impacts to some of this critical infrastructure, such as ports, energy facilities, and wastewater treatment plants that are located on or adjacent to these lands. And we also look at the public good, such as public access, recreation, and tourism, fisheries, coastal ecosystems, and all things that will be affected by sea level rise and climate change. Therefore, it's pretty urgent that we're doing all we can to understand these risks and plan for how we will adapt to them and protect the public lands and assets. Before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge our 2016 to 2020 strategic work plan and highlight that leading adaptive, innovative, and responsible land and resource management is our #1 priority moving forward. And as part of that, we're committed to incorporating strategies that address climate change, adapt to sea level rise, incentivize water conservation, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the generation of litter and marine debris. And those are things that are going into all of our planning processes and decisions. So AB 691 is just one of those efforts that we're undertaking to achieve this goal. But in general, we also require that sea level rise information be incorporated into any of our lease applications, whether they're for granted lands or not. We include sea level rise analysis in our staff reports to inform lessees of the risks and changing conditions, and we encourage them to engage in adaptation planning. Through our lease terms and other mechanisms, we collaborate with lessees to address climate impacts and coordinate with agency partners on state and local sea level rise adaptation and coastal resilience science planning guidance and the implementation of adaptation. All right, these are the grantees that are subject to AB 691, and these are all grantees who have an average income of $250,000 or more in annual public trust revenues within their granted land area. And here's a list of the 33 grantees that are required by the state to submit an assessment. And the number on the list is actually 34 if you include Manhattan Beach with the asterisks. Manhattan Beach was below the cusp of 250,000, but had already started their assessment and decided to follow through with it, even though they weren't required. So if there's anyone listening from Manhattan Beach today, thank you. We recognize that these granted land areas are all very different, and their challenges and responses to sea level rise will be site-specific. For example, the adaptation strategies of a large commercial port, such as Long Beach, are likely to be very different from those of Santa Cruz, whose revenue is generated primarily by tourism from beach visits and the wharf. But we're using these different lenses to identify their commonalities and differences, and as part of our effort to understand sea level rise vulnerability to public trust lands and resources statewide. I quickly want to go over the Ocean Protection Council's updated sea level rise guidance that falls under the larger umbrella of the goals of the Natural Resource Agency's Safeguarding California plan. It's important to note that the guidance laid out in this document is not prescriptive policy per se, but rather a methodology developed by the objective work of scientists and specialists throughout California for state and local governments to analyze and assess the risks associated with sea level rise. So I'll refer to the Ocean Protection Council throughout this presentation as OPC. So OPC's guidance did offer preferred planning approaches and things to consider, which are summarized in the bullet points that you'll see to the left. So the State Lands Commission adopted this guidance as a framework and is building upon it and taking the next steps towards implementation through AB 691. So keep that in mind as we go forward today. All right. So the Ocean Protection Council's steps for identifying the most at-risk resources and assets that you see here closely reflect AB 691's criteria #1 that you'll soon see. Like I mentioned, OPC has put forth guidance for assessing sea level rise impacts, and it is up to us to build upon it. So identifying the nearest tidal gauge, evaluating the proposed project or development's lifespan, assessing the attributes that make the project vulnerable, and considering different sea level rise projections are the first steps to take when evaluating the potential risks and adaptation pathways. The guidance provides projections for 12 tide gauges along the California coast, and this is an example of what the projections look like for the tide gauge in San Francisco, kind of in the center of the state. In contrast to the previous state guidance taken from the National Resource Council's 2012 report, this chart includes probabilities for sea level rise projections. So in the first column on the left, we have years ranging from 2030 to 2150. And for the years 2050 and beyond, projections begin to diverge, and we have sea level rise projections based on high and low emission scenarios. So the high emission scenario is based on a business as usual projection, and the low emission scenario reflects the most stringent global greenhouse gas reduction goals. And for each year, as you go across the row, you can find sea level rise projections based on a probability of occurrence. And for example, in the column in the center of the graphic there that says likely range at the top, there's a 66% probability that sea level rise will be somewhere between the two numbers in that column. And in the column to the right of that, there is a 5% probability that sea level rise will meet or exceed that amount. And one more column over, there's a 0.5% probability that sea level rise will meet these projections. And in the far right column are sea level rise projections for an extreme sea level rise scenario, which is known as H++, which doesn't yet have an associated probability. You'll notice that there are blue highlighted boxes around these three columns, and these are considered low risk aversion, medium, high risk aversion, and extreme risk aversion, and these can be used to decide what sea level rise projections to use in planning based on your level of risk aversion and what you are attempting to protect. All right, now for the nuts and bolts. AB 691 legislation was signed in October of 2013, and grantees have had over 5 years to develop a comprehensive assessment based on the four main criteria with subcategories that will follow on the next slide. But I first want to say that climate and sea level rise science are constantly evolving and advancing fields, and a lot has happened since the legislation passed in 2013, including a few of our grantees being very proactive in submitting their assessment years in advance. But for AB 691, they are actually all due next week on July 1st, and we've been working closely with all grantees to integrate the most recent projections and guidance into their assessments. All right, I'm going to quickly walk us through the four criteria here that were written into the AB 691 legislation as required submission criteria. Number one, we're looking for an assessment of impacts of sea level rise to public trust lands and assets. Criteria number two is we're asking grantees to include maps of their granted public trust lands with the projected sea level rise impacts of 2030, 2050, and 2100, as well as the impacts from a 100-year storm on top of each of those projections. Number three, we are looking for the financial costs associated with sea level rise. And criteria number four, we're asking grantees for descriptions of how they propose to protect and adapt resources and structures that would be impacted by sea level rise. And we're also asking for, future potential partnerships and so on, but we'll get into that. So, starting with the first step, in order to understand how these coastal hazards will impact coastal communities and to eventually identify appropriate adaptation responses, we must first have a good understanding and inventory of what assets we're dealing with and their associated risks. So these assets should include both natural and human-made resources and facilities with consideration to the sea level rise impacts based on your local conditions and trends, which could include, but is not limited to, extreme weather events and changing shorelines due to storm surges, waves, runoff, erosion, and so on. So once that is understood, a grantee can better prioritize the vulnerabilities to be addressed and where to focus their efforts. And this may be based on many constraints, financial, time, or public safety. So built assets include things like ports, energy and utility infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants, and stormwater drainage systems that are all very critical infrastructure. And the latter few that I just mentioned are things that a general audience doesn't often think about when considering the impacts of sea level rise, but as many know, these gravity-driven water systems like wastewater treatment facilities and stormwater drainage are often located near sea level along the coast. And as they say, stuff flows downhill or something like that. And it's this underground gravity force infrastructure that is out of sight and often out of mind that is going to cause some major issues. It's also important to consider the infrastructure and assets that support public access and recreation and navigability or fishing, such as wharfs and piers. And maintaining public access and recreation opportunities is one of the pillars of State Lands Commission's mission. For natural resources, we're talking about things like beaches, dunes, and wetlands, which have a plethora of economic benefits and environmental benefits that we'll get into when discussing financials and non-market valuation in criteria number 3. Moving on. All right, so the purpose of assessment criteria number 2 is to make sure that grantees have done their due diligence by visualizing what their granted lands might look like with sea level rise in 2030, 2050, and 2100. And these dates are meant to help us understand short-term, mid-term, and long-term impacts and planning horizons. So what you see here is in the photo is actually a screenshot from the State Lands Commission sea level rise viewer that we will soon be publicly releasing, possibly this week, so stay tuned for that. So this shot shows our active leases in the San Francisco Bay Area with 5 feet of sea level rise, and this viewer is intended to be used by the public, grantees, and commission staff to think about and plan for sea level rise in both ungranted and granted areas. And as you can see, there's a lot to be considered, and we have our work cut out for us. There are also a number of other sea level rise viewers that are publicly available, each with their own unique functions, and the list you see on the right reflects that. And creating these maps helps identify the most vulnerable areas and can serve as a communication tool to engage local and state stakeholders in understanding where they need or we need to focus our priorities for adaptation and protection. All right, so estimating the financial cost of sea level rise. This is where things get interesting. Estimating the financial cost of sea level rise is intended to assist grantees in identifying what adaptation strategies to pursue and prioritize and effectively plan for implementation of those strategies. And I'll start by describing the graph you see here. This is not actually from an AB 691 assessment, but rather a larger report completed by the Nature Conservancy for the Southern Monterey Bay in 2016. And for those that know, the Southern Monterey Bay is actually the fastest eroding coastline in California. And the findings of this report were that in all but the most immediate short-term cases of 2030 planning, any further hardening of the shoreline provides the smallest amount of economic benefits in the long run. And so properly valuing non-market assets is extremely important and something to keep in mind. And again, the effects of climate change and sea level rise are going to have, if they haven't already, pretty enormous economic and social implications for the state's future, and they're likely going to be bigger than we realize or can forecast now. So following the reception of all AB 691 submissions, the State Lands Commission intends to evaluate the cost estimate information provided and make recommendations to the state for developing programs that support local needs for implementation. And it's important to know that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach for estimating the associated costs, and providing complete quantitative financial estimates that take into consideration a variety of different factors can be extremely difficult to do, but every grantee still needs to address this requirement, which I personally believe is the most important. So we're looking for information to help us understand the costs associated with damages and impacts to assets as described in assessment criteria number 1, and the costs associated with adaptation strategies selected by grantees to mitigate for those impacts and build greater resiliency for public trust assets. And on a positive note, we're also asking for inclusion of any economic benefits that are associated with certain adaptation strategies. So financial cost estimates of sea level rise impacts can include the repair or replacement costs of assets or the value of land that will potentially become inundated, but they can and should also include non-market valuation of natural capital and ecosystem services. And while these valuation methods will differ based on the spatial and physical characteristics of the granted land, we are asking each grantee to take the time to describe their methodology so that commission staff can understand why a particular valuation approach was chosen. And there are many ways to do this, such as the willingness to pay and contingent valuation method, travel cost methods for some of the more tourism-based granted lands, hedonic pricing, and so on. If anyone wants to discuss further these methods and how we're using them to understand sea level rise impacts, I'm happy to chat offline later. So I personally like to think of money as a sort of universal language, especially when it comes to non-market ecological considerations, such as endangered species or important wetland functions and habitats, or even the value of a day at the beach. with your family. If the loss of these ecosystem services fails to perk the attention of a policy or decision maker, being able to put a dollar sign on assets and resources can be very important and useful, and is something that mostly everyone can understand. So that being said, equally important are California's natural coastal resources, such as beaches, dunes, and intertidal areas and wetlands, which are vulnerable to inundation and increased erosion, but are not really easy to put a price tag on. For one, sea level rise can alter or convert entire ecological dynamics that are extremely important as non-market ecosystem services, such as nurseries or habitats for birds and fish, natural sediment replenishment, coastal runoff contaminant filtration, prevention of saltwater intrusion, carbon sequestration, and of course, coastal access and recreational use that California's coastal tourism economy is pretty heavily dependent on. And it's pretty important to understand that the damages to California coast will have far-reaching impacts across the entire country and inland places that depend on the many resources that come or go through California. I should have included these few facts that I'm about to run through in a separate slide, but just hang with me here. These are economic benefits of the California coast. So port activities in California generate an estimated $7 billion in state and local tax revenue annually and employ more than 500,000 people in California. And nationwide, there are more than 2 million jobs connected to California ports. And here's a recent quote from the Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis. Although California does not set trade policy, we have more to gain or lose than any other state. 30% of U.S. exports and 40% of imports come through California ports, and trade supports 20% of the state's workforce. And every day, $1 billion worth of goods flow through the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles alone, which is the largest port complex in the country. And one more fact is, in 2002, a labor contract dispute shut down cargo operations at West Coast ports for 10 days, including Oregon and Washington, and that cost the national economy roughly $1 billion each day. And it's important to note that sea level rise is not confined to the borders of California. So if our ports are shut down, likely all the West Coast ports will be shut down, and that price tag will add up pretty quickly. And one more recreational example is that the coastal tourism economy contributes well over $40 billion annually to the entire state of California. So my point of all that is that the facts I just mentioned should be incorporated into an economic valuation being done for AB 691. All right, criteria number 4, a description of how grantees propose to protect and preserve resources and structures that would be impacted by sea level rise. So this slide is an overview of the many different types of sea level rise adaptation strategies, and they can be broadly categorized into 3 commonly accepted strategies that you see on the left, with the 4th strategy being the no intervention approach. This no intervention approach is very likely going to lead to unacceptable exposure for hazards, for coastal resources, and as a major storm or other event occurred, it would place a strain on community resources and public safety, most importantly, such as a building falling off a cliff and broken infrastructure in Pacifica. The remaining 3 commonly accepted strategies to avoid this are broadly classified as protect, accommodate, or retreat. And which method is chosen depends pretty heavily on several different factors that are specific to localized areas. So in the upper right corner, you'll see a seawall or bulkhead that represents the employment of engineered structures or other measures to defend development or resources in its current location. And oftentimes, these are without changes to the development itself, and this is the protection strategy. Protection can be broadly categorized into hard or soft defensive measures, which I have a good graphic for in the next slide. And hard armoring is, as of now, the more common protection strategy and refers to these engineered structures such as seawalls or revetments that defend against coastal hazards that defend against wave run-up and flooding. So soft options refer to living shorelines like dunes and wetlands that move us down into the overlap area of the bottom left photo in the category of accommodate. which again I'll provide some examples for in a moment. So accommodation strategies use methods that modify existing development or changes or designs new development that decrease the risk of hazards and thus increase resiliency. On an individual project scale, this might include flood-proofing retrofits or designing structures to be easily moved or relocated or even elevated. And on a community scale, accommodation strategies include things such as land use designation, zoning ordinances, or strategies such as clustering any new developments in less vulnerable areas. And like I mentioned, many accommodation options do indeed overlap with the category of protect. And finally, we have retreat strategies, or as I like to consider it, allowed erosion. And as an aside here, I'll just mention that erosion is a geophysical process that allows for the littoral sediment movement that keeps our beaches nourished, and it is often not adequately considered in planning, and we've built in some areas that are especially vulnerable to erosion. But anyways, retreat strategies would relocate and remove existing development out of a hazard area and limit or stop the construction of any new development in vulnerable areas. An example of this might be an acquisition or buyout program, or requiring that new development is removed once sea level reaches a certain point. And this strategy definitely requires the most intervention and planning, but in the long run, it may provide the most resilience and ecological benefit. All right, as I mentioned, the green to gray spectrum of coastal defense, accommodation, and adaptation strategies. On the far left, we have nature-based or natural infrastructure, also referred to as living shorelines, which many different entities such as the California Coastal Commission, Coastal Conservancy, Ocean Protection Council, and of course, State Lands Commission encourage wherever possible. And as we move to the right, the solutions become gray and hard, and protect in place may realistically be the most feasible option in areas that are space limited with critical or water dependent infrastructure. And this is something that the State Lands Commission now carefully considers on a case-by-case basis. As this next slide suggests, green infrastructure can actually have incredible benefits, and by incorporating green infrastructure and design into a project wherever possible, we're essentially adjusting to the problem of sea level rise on both ends of mitigation and adaptation. So these benefits include reduced erosion, accretion of sediment, attenuation of wave energy, creation of fish and wildlife habitat, and they may also provide better outdoor recreation and sequester carbon and act as a buffer for ocean acidification or saltwater intrusion. So pretty important stuff. Moving on here. So there are, of course, limitations to be considered, such as local features. We can't just put an oyster reef in an area that is not suitable oyster habitat or that receives a lot of wave energy, for example. And permitting for these kind of living shoreline projects can also be quite complicated. But that being said, California does have a number of living shoreline pilot projects in motion, and the process is being streamlined. So we're hoping that many of our grantees identify and prioritize projects that utilize this approach. And on that note, I'll just say that an important consideration for AB 691 is the implication to other state and federal agencies tasked with managing and protecting public trust resources, which address the final subcategory for criteria number 4, which is to identify regional partnerships to complement the identified adaptation strategies. You know, for example, if one grantee to the north puts in a seawall, it's going to have effects on the grantee to the south, and we're trying to avoid that as best as possible. Anyways, the findings of this project may be critical to informing multiple coastal and ocean management agencies, and we'll be sharing the information from grantee assessments with other federal, state, and local agencies so that we can work in collaboration with them and the grantees to address these challenges that we're all facing. All right, I'm quickly gonna walk through just a couple examples, one from each criteria of reports that have already been submitted. In the first slide, for criteria number 1, which is an assessment and inventory of assets, we have in the left 2 photos from Coyote Point in San Mateo County. where exactly they're built and natural resources are, which include everything from parking lots to firearm ranges to mudflats. And on the right, we have a screenshot from the Port of Long Beach's facilities with a map that identifies where each facility is, which is actually very, very helpful in our evaluation of the assessments. It's really helpful to be able to put a place to a name. And as you can imagine, the Port of Long Beach has more commercial and critical infrastructure than they do natural resources, so that is one consideration. And I'll just mention in this photo, this is the projections for 2030. So as you can see, they already have a few fire stations and tugboat and barge mooring areas that are expected to be covered up, which is going to cause a need for action. Next, we have a map of Santa Cruz, and this is, again, for criteria number 2, to include maps of 2030, 2050, and 2100. So this map of Santa Cruz is under multiple layers of sea level rise projections out to the medium high risk aversion scenario for 2100, which is roughly 5.2 feet of sea level rise for Santa Cruz. And as you can see, it's not looking great for the boardwalk. Santa Cruz has made a very helpful map that shows their granted land boundary superimposed on sea level rise projections, which really bring to light the reality of the situation and potential boundary disputes down the line. I'll just mention that as of now, the high tide line by which the sea level boundary is measured is ambulatory, which means it moves based on sea level, and we don't yet have a legal framework for addressing this, so that is something to consider. They also included their coastal access points, which appear to all be submerged, and they also included where they have armored the coast with that dotted black and white line there. And as you can see, a picture really is worth 1,000 words here, so I'll just leave it at that. All right, so Monterey just submitted their report a few weeks ago and provided a very detailed quantification of their economic impacts forecasted out to 2100. They broke it down into multiple categories that include tideland specific revenue loss, city revenue loss, as well as market and non-market valuation. I won't go too deep into these, but as you can see, those numbers for losses are extremely high, and they are based off current characteristics and adaptation capacity of Monterey, and those are also annual. So the point here is that understanding your financial risks may really help develop a proactive and precautionary approach that might save a lot of money in the long run. And last but not least, an example of criteria number 4, which is a description of how trustees propose to protect and preserve their resources and structures. This is another one from Monterey here. In the photo on the left, Monterey noted that adapting to sea level rise can sometimes be as simple as mimicking nature by creating an artificial tide pool or reefs that attenuate sediment and diminish wave energy that causes the unnecessary erosion in the first place. And the photo to the right is the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where they have retrofitted a seawall structure by curving the wall outwards to direct spray and splashing out back to sea. And of course, this won't properly function in the event of overtopping or likely anywhere near overtopping, but it does buy them a little bit more time to identify a more sustainable adaptation approach. And of course, there are many more examples, and all of these assessments will be posted on our website in the coming months as we receive them. And we encourage you all to check out our AB 691 webpage that I will be providing a link for in just a few moments here. So all that being said, and before I wrap it up and take questions, I'll just highlight and describe the next steps that the State Lands Commission is taking. So this assessment collection and review is just the first step in what will eventually become a complete and comprehensive synthesis of adaptation measures as they relate to sea level rise on public trust resources that are subject to AB 691 across the entire state. And this will eventually culminate in a set of recommendations to the state for how to support local implementation efforts. And as far as I know, a true standalone evaluation of these high revenue generating public trust resources, apart from the larger community that they exist in, has never been formally done before in California. But While these assessments are indeed focused, a lot of the information provided by the jurisdiction has come from other efforts, which includes updates to their general plan, local coastal plans, hazard mitigation plans, and so on. So this is important because we're asking grantees to really think about and highlight what are their crucial public trust assets within their granted lands, and that includes a whole spate of natural and built coastal assets. In the end, the entire state of California is going to be liable for these things, and the price tag is going to be extremely large, and it really isn't feasible for the state to leave it to the local grantees to face these challenges. So the jurisdictions subject to AB 691 are balancing these many different planning priorities across many different scales all at the same time. And the difficulties of this are compounded by the difficulties of scenario-based planning as the science and projections continue to evolve, which ultimately changes the risk calculations that they need to project. And while these jurisdictions are diverse and subject to their own local factors, the state has identified the need to step in and help, which is going to take a coordinated effort and collaborative effort all around. So the next steps you see in the slide are our efforts to move sea level rise adaptation forward. And the assessments are just the first step in understanding sea level rise risks and the strategies considered most feasible at the local level. So next, these assessments, after we've collected them all, hopefully after July 1st, they'll be used to develop a cumulative study and set of recommendations for how the state can support and implement local adaptation plans. And we're getting some help from that. In 2018, the commission was authorized to hire an outside consultant whose main tasks will be to help me and everyone else working on AB 691 to identify the priority assets and preferred sea level rise adaptation approaches. They'll help evaluate the economic impacts of sea level rise and recommend short and long-term actions to support local implementation. The recommended actions will reflect a systematic approach to implementing adaptation measures that are intended to provide long-term asset security, ensure public access, safety, and use rights. So as part of bullet point 1, the cumulative study deliverable, which will be a comprehensive report and evaluation study. And this report will synthesize public trust resources and the asset types involving granted lands that are vulnerable to sea level rise, and identify factors that contribute to the priority and risk level of an asset or resource type. It'll describe selected adaptation and the approaches that are commonly preferred by the grantees, and will outline their approach to submission evaluation, outline our approach to submission, evaluation, and review, and describe the data and information gaps. It'll discuss limitations that constrain the analysis and include an economic analysis of financial risks, adaptation cost, and the benefits. And the second deliverable, also a part of the first cumulative study, will be the adaptation summarization report. This report will prioritize and analyze the tools and instruments available to support the implementation of local adaptation strategies to safeguard and build resiliency for the highest priority at-risk assets and resources detailed in each evaluation report. And this report will consider the utility of various tools and instruments related to governance, planning, and most importantly, as I mentioned, and in my opinion, financing. So the third deliverable will be a report with recommendations to the state for supporting these implementation and adaptation strategies and the approaches to safeguard and build resiliency for public trust assets and resources within granted lands. And this report will rely on information in the cumulative study. So throughout these next steps, state land staff will continue to communicate and coordinate with the local grantees that have submitted their reports and sister agencies that may have interest in them. And we'll work with we'll work with the consultant that we hire to explore these interests in establishing an interagency advisory group that could include representatives from local, state, and federal agencies. This advisory group could provide input for the risks and evaluation study, as well as contribute expertise to inform the recommendations for the state to support these local adaptation and implementation plans. Last but not least, I'll just say again that scenario-based planning is very difficult to do. And when it comes to sea level rise, we're mostly in uncharted waters where things change very quickly, and adaptive capacity, collaboration, and management, and being flexible in our approach will be pretty critical to building resilience in the long run. So that about wraps it up, but I just want to provide one more plug for the State Lands Commission and recommend our AB 691 webpage as an excellent resource for all things that I just covered and beyond. This is also where you will be able to find all the completed assessments, and a few of them are actually already up there and available. So that link in the bottom right of the page will direct you there. And with that, I'll wrap up and say thank you all again for joining me today, and I'm happy to take any questions, and feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thank you.